Not all that long ago, this S52 came out of my E36 M3 as an automatic 284,000 mile engine. Not long after that, my good friend Mikey, a now engine mechanic, got to tearing this thing down to see what kind of condition this kind of mileage had. And there was plenty of wear here and there, mostly on the piston walls and in the valve train, which I'll get into a little bit more in a sec. But for a 284,000 mile engine that did leak a little bit of coolant out of the back of the head gasket, it was not that bad. And regardless, we had planned to tear this engine down all the way to the bottom end and rebuild up to the top end, only replacing things that needed to be done, and obviously all the necessary machine work. So again, the first thing we found was wear on the pistons. You can see this on the skirts here and on the side of the piston walls where they had warped and rubbed a little bit, which would mean new pistons and obviously machine work on the block regardless. Up in the valve train, the camshafts and ledges had a little too much wear, and unfortunately they don't have bearings that can be replaced, so that meant new ones. Up next, we disassembled the head as Mikey had the tool to remove all the valves and springs, and once organized, it was time to load up my Lexus truck and take everything down to the machine shop for them to do all their machining and pre-assembly work. Look how tight my oil pump nut was. Not. Holy shit. I hope we all do love the look of freshly clean and machined metal. So you can see in the piston bore here, as well as my head assembled, which you'll see later, and the crankshaft polish. Now, although we had the machine shop check all of our tolerances with bearings, rods, and so on, we still wanted to do the checks that we could with the tools that Mikey had and his experience building engines. So first up, aside from that bore gauge, was using plastic gauge to check our tolerances between the main bearings and rod bearings on our polished crankshaft, and since we have brand new bearings from VAC Motorsports. So though some people won't agree with plastic gauge, remember this is a secondary check and we're just doing what we can to make sure things are okay before we proceed. So it's a double check. It was all good, as you'll see in some measurements here soon, and we were able to move on. And for anyone not familiar with plastic gauge, all it is a piece of plastic that has a precise measurement once torqued down to a certain spec. Torqued down, yes, squished piece of plastic, measured with the gauge, and that tells you your tolerance. Regardless of your opinion, that's pretty cool. Next up in our just to be safe pre-assembly checks, we check the gaps on the piston rings. So you'll see here in the piston ring after it's pressed in, that tiny little gap that we check with a feeler gauge to make sure that tolerance is appropriate. You can see here I didn't hit the stop record button and I didn't record what happened next. After everything checked out, we got to installing the pistons. I did the fourth one here, it took twice as long as Mikey did. Regardless, we got them all in, so check it out. So aside from a small continuance in reassembly, what better time than now to repaint your engine and replace the freeze plugs? For me, I guess I couldn't decide on any better time than now. That, or I just forgot to order paint until right in the middle. The funny part is part of this process is prepping the metal and spraying it with a hose, so it was kind of weird to spray my engine with pistons in it with a garden hose. It didn't turn out the best. One thing I found out with Pour 15 engine paint is that you can't do touch-ups in small areas, otherwise the finish looks different. If you decide to do touch-ups, you need to touch up the entire piece you're painting. Regardless, it's going to be hidden in the engine bay, so it's fine. The other oddity with assembly that I don't remember the exact timeline of was I took my parts to a machine shop twice. So the first time I forgot to get my rotating assembly balance, which is literally balancing everything that rotates in the bottom end of the engine, the pistons, the rods, the crankshaft, as well as the clutch and flywheel. So similar to balancing a wheel and tire where they add metal, in this case they actually take away metal. As they balance the rotating assembly, you'll see here on the rods, they took away a little bit of metal on a couple of the rods and the crankshaft in certain areas just so everything was appropriately balanced. And even on things like the clutch and flywheel, they marked what orientation things were in to make sure when it's assembled, it stays exactly as it was when they balanced it. And I actually had no idea that was a thing. It was something that Dave Pecoraro and Mikey both scared me with while we worked at Hoonigan Racing Division. Fortunately, I got it done in time and it was all good and I could sleep. You saw the timing cover go on there as well with a little bit of anaerobic gasket maker on the gaskets. Ironically, that wasn't the only time it would go on thanks to yours truly ordering the wrong chains. And the head gasket, a multi-layered steel head gasket. Honestly, the only reason I ended up ordering this is because I could order it in a slightly oversized thickness to be able to compensate for the little bit of metal that came off both the head and the block in machine work. Definitely not necessary because of how small it is, but here we are, so there we are. You may have noticed a couple alignment pins or studs sticking out of the block as well. Those are just old head bolts that we cut the heads off of just to work as alignment pins, as you see Mikey remove it there to make it easier to get the head on and aligned. You also may notice a difference in springs, and I'll talk about those in a sec. And we are on to torquing the head to the block. So we are using factory head bolts here. They are stretch bolts and it is torque to yield. We are going in a certain sequence all around the block to make this as evenly as possible as defined by the almost useless Bentley. We first start by torquing every bolt to a certain foot poundage, and then we go back and do each bolt with a certain amount of degrees, which you'll see here. Same thing again. And we do it twice. So fortunately, having a super expensive snap-on torque wrench, thanks to Mikey, you can do that foot poundage and those degrees. Mikey also marked each bolt the first time and the second time so that we know that each bolt got the full treatment, and that means that this job is appropriately done. We are on to the valve train. So part of it was already assembled at the machine shop. All but one of the original valves was able to be reused, cut, and seated properly, as well as all new valve guides, and I had them do the springs as well. We'll wait just one more second to talk about the springs as we get all new lifters installed in our brand new cam ledges. Mikey was confident in his ability here to get this on in one try, and unfortunately for him in this first failure, we actually installed the exhaust side on the intake side and vice versa, so we ended up having to do this a total of 4 times, and by the end, Mikey got pretty good at it and proved himself. And here's the reason we had to deal with springs, or at least I decided to. Schrick camshafts, the 256-264 camshaft, the milder of all of them, but I did decide to do VAC high performance springs just to avoid any chance of floating, which is simply just the spring not being able to rebound and keep up with the camshaft, being pushed too far down and not maintaining contact with the lifter and the camshaft. And there we are, having realized it, and here we are reinstalling it each side for a second time, a total of 4. Again, sometimes redoing things makes you extra special and extra good at it, right? Or just extra special. Once the camshafts were installed, we also installed the timing blocks on the backs of the camshafts just to hold those appropriately. We torqued everything down, and then we moved on to rebuilding the Vanos unit and getting ready to set timing. Having never rebuilt Vanos by myself, it definitely seemed like there was a weird voodoo around it, but it's really, really easy, and I recommend doing it yourself. Race German has a great kit for it.
Over-torqued. Over-torqued.
This is when we realized we were missing a new chain, and one of the chains was actually on in the incorrect spot under the timing cover, so that had to come off. We put the right chain on, tried to seal the edges up with Hylamar. Everything went back on smoothly, and I don't think we're going to have any sealing issues. Then we found that one of our studs for mounting the Vanos was totally loose. At this point, we had to order a helicoil insert. Mikey then drilled into the head just for an appropriate space, tapped it for the helicoil insert, thread locker, inserted, then installed the stud. Everything felt firm and fine, and it was on to installing the Vanos, no problem. And finally, a brand new oil pump outfitted by VAC with a safety nut and safety wire. This paired with an oil baffle welded into the oil pan, and I felt a lot more safe about oil consumption and the life of this engine. Manual swap, you need a manual transmission. Ironically, this one came from the car that was originally meant for this whole project. A 1997 328i in Boston green metallic. It had seen better days, and so when I found the M3, I decided to switch to the M3 and steal the transmission out of this one. It does run and drive again now with its current owner. this transmission, when it came out, was disgusting with foam and sound deadening all over it. Now, aside from what a pressure washer could initially remove, it still required some chemical help, and that's where bug and tar came in. Ironically, it's not just for bugs and tar, it also works on oily messes like this. So spraying it on and agitating it then allowed the pressure washer to make easy work of all the oil and film on this transmission, leaving nothing but a beautiful, clean, used 5-speed transmission. Once cleaned, it was time to do the work that you can only do while the transmission is out of the car, and that's the detent repair service. And this is a kit that comes from Race German and makes it super easy to handle. So all we're doing here is removing the old detents, which does involve taking a cap off, pulling the old detent and spring out, pulling the sleeve out, which is the hardest part, and then reinstalling everything with the tools that come with the kit, or in my case from Jake Passard in California. Thank you for shipping me those. And as well, you can see this one is done here. I got a little ahead of myself not recording the first one, but the second one here I show you everything. So removing the cap, the spring comes right out, slide hammer to get the first detent out, and then deforming the sleeve, yanking it out, and then reverse order for installing everything. So the 2 detents on the side correspond with 5th gear and reverse. These 3 on the top I actually don't know. I'm sure you guys do. But the process is pretty much the same. Removing a cap, the detent, the spring. Fortunately, not the sleeve. These kits actually come with a sleeve that you can press into the current sleeve. Then install that detent, install that spring, and then press in a metal cap. This time it's not plastic, and this time there's not a lock ring. Simple as that. Time for seals. Well, it's easiest to do, again, outside of the car. And this one's all pretty self-explanatory, so you can just live vicariously through my seal installations. To reinstall this flange, I show you here, because I'd already done it, how I counter-held with a couple bolts, counter-held with a couple feet, and then did the double torquing sequence to get that flange back on. I also wanted to jump in here. I don't know why I'd never thought about it, but I never realized that these 2 things are wear items, but unsurprisingly, they are. Also with that tube and that fork, I don't show myself installing them here. I do the brass pivot pin. I did install the fork in that tube right before installing them on the engine, which you also don't see later, but trust me, they're in there. I already knew this was going to be a party, and I didn't know is how mad I was going to get, and you'll never know either. So the inners on these axles are a lot like other BMWs, like my E28, so it wasn't a big deal. The big deal is the outers, and the reason they're a big deal is because it's really hard to manipulate the ball bearings back inside this cup. You can't access the ball bearings from both sides and stabilize them. So the first one in itself, just that outer, took me many hours. You could have seen the clock there. The second time I did it, I actually found it was easiest to put the ball bearings back in with the shaft facing up, as you see right here. And I did them all at once, cockeying the cup kind of to one side and then slipping all the bearings in with grease at once. It was still not super easy. I should make a video on it, but it is capable in being done. The only problem I was still left with is these outer boot clamps from the Rhine replacement kit. They don't quite fit in the cavity of the outer control arms, and I still haven't quite figured it out, and that's what I'm paying for by not paying for the $75 BMW kits. So after my confidence had been tested with those axles, it was restored in the end, and with doing this job, as I've done clutches on an LSD before. Here I'm just testing the ratio as I spin the input shaft 3.38 times, the output shaft spin a total of only 1 time. This is confirmed a 3.38 LSD out of an automatic E36 M3. And I'm going to reuse it because I like that little bit of extra speed versus, I believe, what, 315s in the manual ones? Remember on those output flanges to keep those rings paired with each side. So as the LSD unit comes out here, I took a look at the bearings. They're surprisingly not that bad. They're not fantastic, but if you saw the one in the E28, you'd understand why I'm okay with keeping these ones in here, as that diff is doing absolutely fine. And it's on to opening up the LSD unit. It won't be incredibly informational, though I'm still going to show everything. If you guys want to see a more informational video on all of what is included in these diffs, there's a link to my other video on doing this in the description and maybe above. So here we have the first clutch coming out. You can almost see the condition out of focus there. And right here is where I pull out the spacer that we won't be putting back in, as that's where our third extra clutch is going to be sitting. As well, before installing the clutches, they have been soaking in diff fluid to avoid burnout during the braking period. So as we get into repainting the diff here, one thing I did want to add is this is the Pour 15 paint that I also used on the engine block. I'm also going to cover up the S for LSD because I wanted to keep that and there was no rust around it, so it's easy to still include that. But all I'm ended up doing here is applying a metal prep solution that allows any of the exposed metal to be prepped for paint, rinsing it with water. And then this is actually my final coat of Pour 15 in my bathroom, which you don't get to see. And then this is after. So once again, like the engine, every time I wanted to do touch-ups, I had to touch the entire block with that sponge applicator. Otherwise, it would dry differently between the two spots. And unlike the engine, this turned out incredibly. So I'm happy that I learned my Pour 15 lesson and we're good to reassemble. And one thing I didn't show or say, I did replace those seals inside these output shafts. Can anyone spot the solution I'm using to make an extra bit of gasket here? Hint, it's made by Toyota. So for one of the last bits of major assembly, we have the rear subframe. And ironically, these pieces have been ready to go almost the longest of anything, and they're near last for getting put together. We're gonna start with the polyurethane bushings from RevShift. I don't know them, I've never used them, but they seem widely used on E36s, and I'm happy that their softer compound is black as it fits in as a very stock look. Beyond that, I had to do a little bit of prep for these guys, as the powder coating shop ended up blasting the insides of the cavities for these bearings, though the tolerances still seem plenty tight, and in doing so with a shop press, thank you Mo, this job is super easy. Here's actually one of the few stock bushings I used. I ordered it when I didn't fully know how this assembly worked. I actually ordered too many, which if you know me, like Jance and Nick do, that happens a lot. And then moving on to the trailing arm, these bearings use 2 of each side, and with this new cup installation kit, I was super happy that one of these cups fit perfectly around the rubber to make this install as easy as possible. I'll leave the link for this kit. It's got cool bearings for the washers and everything too. And I actually found it because of another BMW dude on YouTube. And, oh man, you guys can see it too. Oh no! I swore to myself I wouldn't make this mistake, and it's all Matt Cuspel's fault. It's actually not. But, so I ended up having to cut this side's dust shield just to finagle it on, and it's totally okay, it's not a big deal. But ironically, with my E28, this happened when I did it too. I put the wrong dust shields on the wrong side, so I'm technically 0 for 3 in remembering to put the proper dust shields on each side, until this one. I got it right here, so 1 for 4. If it was baseball, that wouldn't be too bad of a batting average. With the LSD slipped in and everything else connected and bushings mounted, it was time to then slip in the CV axles, which I did have to disconnect the outer joint of the upper control arm to do. And once doing so is when I found out with these outer boot clamps from the Raiten replacement kits, when clamped down, there wasn't enough clearance in this cavity down here. This is the factory one. This one is from Bellmetric. That's a few millimeters too big. I just ordered it per size and the only size they ironically had. I still have to figure it out. Pelican says they haven't had any issues with it. I'll figure it out. But for now, most importantly, let's enjoy these before and afters to really see how far this thing has come in this past year. It's nice. It's crazy. I also hadn't yet mentioned the new lower control arms, which are aftermarket pieces from Drift HQ. They're thicker steel pieces, so they should be stronger, and they allow for much easier adjustment on camera for alignments. As well, you're going to notice a few things that aren't quite included yet in the after photos, like brakes and the sway bar. That I decided I needed to clean up and paint a little bit. This is the front one where you can see the mount was. The rear one has just a little bit of crust on it. As well, the drive shaft from the manual green car. Just a little bit of surface rust on it, nothing crazy. So I did some sanding by hand on the drive shaft, very light. Prepped it and painted everything, just as simple as that. Overspray, no problem. Super light painting, but just to stop everything from corroding further. So back to that sagging, delaminating glove box. My initial fix didn't work with the liquid nails. You'll see it all sitting in here along with all of the glitter that still keeps finding itself everywhere, including the inside of the ECU, by the way. Once I had the old glue cleaned off, I applied some 3M high strength glue, including some E6000 glue on the inside as well, clamped it and let it sit for 3 days. And during those 3 days, I decided to do a few other things, like replacing my HVAC cluster with a Fahrenheit version instead of Celsius, polishing my dash cluster, finally installing my 3 pedals, or the pedal box, including these provisions that are already there on automatic cars. I always love that. We have the gravity fed line that goes up to the brake fluid reservoir, and then we have the clutch line that goes to the slave cylinder on the transmission. This is a Chase Bays version without the center hard line. It's really sweet to see 3 pedals in this thing finally. As well, I did get the replacement Renown Champion horn pad wheel, this one being the Motorsport version with the tricolor stitching to commemorate the wheel that was in this car. This is a switch for a brake switch so that I can wire in a clutch safety release so that my cruise control still works, as well as a reverse light wiring. A rubber shifter boot with that weird wire thing that they always give you to help you install it. I used an E28 strut cap to fill this hole with a little RTV, and then you see these 3 blank ones here. Clean those up and fill them with some clips as well. Finally installed the shifter arm just to feel like I was almost there, and cut out a little extra space to still include the foam from the automatic shifter, because you can never have enough sound deadening. Onto the gas tank. This filler neck was definitely as old as the car. Replaced that, checked the tank to make sure it was clean, poured the gas out, spilled it everywhere, and then attached appropriate hoses and got it back in the car. Replaced the interior fan with a brand new unit because this is the easiest time to ever do it. Sprayed out a bunch of dust and glitter as well. Also readjusted the foam gasket between the HVAC and ECU panel. Replaced the heater core hoses because this is the easiest time to do it. Installed the front subframe. Pressed out the barely used old control arm bushings and put in polyurethane ones. Installed the control arms. Rebuilt the injectors with the Race German kit. What a cute bunch of colors. Extracted 3 of the 4 bolts that Danny White broke off on the driveline bracket. And then 3 days later, the glove box cover was done drying. So a little residue I'll still have to clean off, but as far as delamination goes, it seems pretty strong. Got it all popped back in, and while out of the car, it seemed to align up okay, but once in the car, there's still definitely a little bit of sag on the right side. Regardless, it looks a million times better than it did. It's not delaminating, and for now, this is a great fix. And finally, we are on to suspension. I'm not going to delve into everything with these just yet because I'm going to do more later, but these are the DS series coilovers from BC Racing. Thank you to BC for providing these to me, Cody specifically for sponsoring these for this build, and of course Scott at Renown for introducing us. I'm super excited to be running a set of these, as a lot of my friends have these and I've never gotten to try some yet. So from here, it was just a simple front suspension bearing hub install. Don't forget the heat shield ever. I'm really good at that, at least on the fronts. And beyond that, super simple stuff. And I'm gonna let the images do the talking from here. After 25 years and 284,000 miles in the same place, the engine bay of an E36 M3, we pulled this S52 out in March of 2022, and finally it's time to dress it and put it back where it came from. And although this is a stock build, it's still a big accolade for me because I've never rebuilt an engine in my life. Of course, with the help of a good friend like Mikey Wetzel. So after not quite dropping it off of the engine stand, which was such a scary moment, it was time to install the rear main seal on the pilot bearing. This FAG brand pilot bearing was a little bit too loose, so we used some retaining sleeve fluid to hold that in there, this specifically, and it was good to go. From there, we did the single mass flywheel instead of the stock dual mass onto the clutch, which I didn't talk about. It's this brand here that I got from FCP Euro. And finally, the clutch fork and throwout bearing that I told you weren't going to see installed because I forgot to really shoot it. Transmission is on. One last thing left to do. Here we are at the full circle moment where this freshly rebuilt engine is back in its engine bay. Yeah, it feels really good. And back to work. So the exhaust studs still had to go back in, and now they're in. Beyond that, then the headers, and of course the secondary air system connection. I almost didn't put this back in, but for the sake of the environment and my cats, I decided I would. I mean catalytic converters, not my cat socks. This is the first time the shifter has been attached to the transmission too, which is exciting. To pair with that excitement, I had to restore the old shift boot with Hybrid Solutions leather mist, as well as the shift knob to give them a nice, clean, supple feeling. And yeah, that looks good. And back to the balancing act that is the rear subframe going into the rear end. So this is cool how well balanced it is, but it's not really that surprising. We then found out that the jack couldn't reach high enough, so we really tested our balance skills with a 4x4, got it up in there secured, and no problem. Then we were on to the Parts Shop Max rear strut bar, which also attaches to these subframe mounts. Once we got the BC shocks aligned in the rear, we could then snug everything down. This is the hole that I did have to drill through to get to the threads. I nicked them a little bit, but there was still plenty to work with. With everything snugged down, it fit great. Decided to trim the carpet as well, and I think it looks right at home. And just as purely shiny as my bald head is, this rear subframe needed some Hybrid Solutions Mist Pure Shine as well before those after shots. Nice and detailed, and looking real good. Although this is a reassembly episode, obviously there's still a lot of reassembly left. We have things like the brakes, engine accessories, and more obviously the entire front end of the car. On top of that, there are a couple problems I still have to fix. I didn't notice it when we initially removed it from the car, or at least the severity of it, but there was some rubbing and melting on the harness. I didn't think it was as bad as it was, but upon cutting it open further and further, it goes and goes and goes, which just isn't safe to use. So a new used one is on the way there, as well as ECU work to tune out the automatic transmission. So obviously Boone and I have a lot of work still left to do, but we are close to firing this thing up, and we are very, very excited. Thanks for watching. Turtle Wax, dedicated to the drive.